Rainy nights have always given me an eerie feeling. It was one such night when I had an encounter that still haunts me. The relentless downpour was like a constant drumming on the roof, creating an atmosphere of solitude that I usually found comforting. But this night, it was different. I had just finished a long day at work and was heading home, my windshield wipers swaying back and forth, battling the heavy rain. The streets were nearly empty, and the faint glow of the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows. My car's tires splashed through puddles as I navigated the slick roads. As I approached a desolate stretch of road, I noticed a figure up ahead. A solitary man, drenched by the rain, was standing by the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. It was a scene I'd encountered before, a hitchhiker seeking refuge from the rain. However, something about this man made my heart race. His clothes were disheveled, and his face was obscured by the hood of his tattered jacket. I couldn't see his features, but I could feel his eyes on me as I approached. A sudden chill coursed through my body as I slowed down and came to a stop. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window. The man leaned closer, his hood still obscuring his face. "Could you give me a lift?" he asked, his voice shaky, as if he were drenched not only in rain but in fear. I hesitated, my instincts warning me that something was off. "Where are you headed?" I finally asked. He hesitated too, and then replied, "Just a few miles down the road." "Anywhere you can drop me would be fine." I decided to trust my gut and reluctantly unlocked the car doors. He climbed into the passenger seat, his wet clothes soaking the upholstery, and the car was immediately filled with a musty, damp odor. As we continued down the rain-soaked road, the atmosphere in the car grew increasingly tense. The only sound was the relentless pitter-patter of rain on the roof. I attempted small talk, asking the man about his day, but he responded with vague and evasive answers. A sense of unease crept over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I contemplated what to do. I noticed his hands. They were trembling uncontrollably, and my suspicion deepened. As we approached the supposed drop-off point, I decided it was time to end this unsettling journey. I pulled over to the side of the road and turned to the man. "This is as far as I can take you," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond but continued to stare ahead, his hood still obscuring his face. I felt a chill run down my spine as I reached for the door handle, ready to ask him to leave. That's when he finally turned his head slowly in my direction. His face, illuminated by the dim car interior light, was like nothing I'd ever seen. His eyes were hollow and devoid of emotion, his skin ashen and translucent. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. My heart pounded in my chest, and my instinct screamed at me to get out of there. With a surge of adrenaline, I flung open the car door and bolted out into the pouring rain. I didn't look back, but I could hear the man's unsettling laughter echoing through the night. I ran to the nearest house, pounded on the door, and begged the startled homeowner to call the police. It was only then, in the safety of a stranger's home, that I began to comprehend the gravity of what had just happened. The police arrived promptly, and they conducted a search of the area, but the man had vanished into the rainy night. They assured me that they would do everything they could to locate him, but they could offer no explanation for the encounter or the man's disturbing appearance. This happened to me around 4 years ago now. I was driving alone in my old beat-up sedan. I had received an urgent call from my dad, who needed a ride from a nearby town. It was past midnight, and the road was dark and eerily quiet. As I sped along the deserted highway, my mind drifted to my dad's situation. He rarely asked for help, so it must have been something serious. The tension built up inside me as I contemplated the unknown. Suddenly, A pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, rapidly approaching. The car behind me was tailgating dangerously, and I couldn't make out its make or model. Anxiety surged through me as I glanced at my speedometer. I was already driving above the limit. I switched lanes, hoping the aggressive driver would pass me, but they followed suit. Panic gnawed at me as I realized this wasn't just a careless tailgater, it was someone with malicious intent. My heart raced, and I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. As the menacing vehicle continued to shadow me, my mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe it was a road rage incident, or perhaps they were trying to carjack me. Regardless of the reason, I knew I had to act. I attempted to put some distance between us by accelerating, but the driver behind me matched my speed, inching closer with every second. Fear coursed through my veins as I considered my next move. Up ahead, I spotted a well-lit gas station, a beacon of hope in the inky darkness. I made the split-second decision to make a run for it. As I approached the entrance, I prayed that someone would be there to witness what was happening. I swung into the gas station, tires screeching, and rushed out of my car. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted toward the store, frantically searching for anyone who could help. The gas station attendant was outside, taking a break. I yelled, "Call the police. Someone's chasing me." Without hesitation, the attendant grabbed his phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation, my voice trembling, and he assured me that help was on the way. As we waited for the police, I watched the menacing car slow down and circle the gas station, its headlights illuminating my desperate face. The driver's intent was clear. They weren't going to let me escape so easily. When the police arrived, they quickly surrounded the aggressor's vehicle, guns drawn. The driver was apprehended, and I breathed a sigh of relief. As it turned out, the person behind the wheel was a complete stranger, their motive still a mystery. They were arrested and taken into custody, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. I finally picked up my dad, who was equally baffled by the chilling encounter. We drove home together, our conversation filled with questions and unease. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind kept replaying the events on that desolate highway. I had narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter with a stranger whose intentions I would never fully understand. Me and my buddy, Mark, decided to escape to the woods for a weekend camping trip. We needed a break from our busy lives in the city. It was supposed to be a fun adventure, just the two of us reconnecting with nature. We set up our tent deep in the heart of the forest, away from any trails or other campers. The night was quiet, with only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. We had just finished roasting marshmallows over the campfire, laughing and reminiscing about old times, when we heard a faint rustling outside our tent. Mark and I exchanged glances, thinking it might be a raccoon or a deer. But this wasn't your typical forest noise. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate, and then we heard a voice. It was a low, almost inaudible whisper, like someone muttering just outside the tent. My heart pounded as I strained to make out the words. "Let me in." Mark and I froze, our flashlights poised to reveal the intruder. We asked who it was, but the voice didn't respond. It just kept repeating the same eerie phrase, "Let me in." Mark unzipped the tent slowly, revealing the silhouette of a man standing a few feet away. He was tall and dressed in tattered clothes. His face was hidden in the shadows. "Let me in," he whispered again, his voice tinged with an odd mix of desperation and menace. We were unnerved but decided to help him. Maybe he was lost or in trouble. Mark unzipped the tent further, and the stranger stepped inside. His appearance was unsettling. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes darted around nervously. We asked him if he was okay, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, staring at us with an unnerving intensity. The atmosphere grew tense, and Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances. Suddenly, the stranger's gaze fixated on me. He leaned in close, his breath hot on my neck. "Let me in," he hissed, and I recoiled in fear. That's when I noticed it, a knife clutched tightly in his hand. It gleamed ominously in the dim light, and I knew we were in great danger. Mark and I exchanged a look of sheer terror. Without a word, we lunged at the tent flap, pushing our way past the intruder. We sprinted through the woods, not daring to look back, our hearts pounding as we left the campsite behind. As we finally reached our car, the memory of that eerie whisper and the glint of that knife continued to haunt us. We didn't know what the stranger's intentions were, and we had no desire to find out. The camping trip had taken a dark turn, and it was a chilling encounter we would never forget. I live in a quiet suburban area, where the days usually pass by without much excitement. But one evening, that changed. I was home alone, finishing up some work on my laptop when I heard a knock on the door. It was already quite late, and I wasn't expecting any visitors. I peeked through the peephole and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard and wearing what looked like a company badge. I cautiously opened the door, and he introduced himself as a surveyor conducting a neighborhood survey. He seemed professional at first, explaining that he needed a few minutes of my time to ask some questions about the local community. I obliged, thinking it wouldn't take long. As the conversation progressed, his questions became increasingly personal, delving into details about my daily routine, my neighbors, and even the security measures in my home. It felt intrusive, but I tried to maintain a polite demeanor. Yet, something about his probing questions and intense stare sent shivers down my spine. I tried to steer the conversation back to general topics, but he persisted, getting too close for comfort, invading my personal space. His inquiries started sounding more like prying interrogations, and his demeanor turned from friendly to unnerving. I grew increasingly uncomfortable, feeling a sense of unease and vulnerability. I made excuses to end the conversation, but he persisted, refusing to leave. He started making veiled threats, hinting at dire consequences if I didn't comply with his inquiries. My heart raced as I realized the situation had taken a dangerous turn. I attempted to close the door, but he forcibly blocked it, his demeanor now aggressive and menacing. Fear surged through me, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew I had to get him to leave, so I tried to assertively demand that he go. But he wouldn't budge. His tone became more threatening, his words a mix of intimidation and coercion. I felt trapped in my own home, powerless against this stranger's invasion of my space and privacy. With each passing moment, my fear intensified. I tried to keep a level head, not wanting to provoke him further, but the situation was spiraling out of control. My thoughts raced, considering my options, feeling a sense of desperation and vulnerability. In a moment of panic, I fumbled for my phone, ready to dial emergency services. But his sudden movement startled me. He lunged forward, attempting to force his way in. I stumbled back, locking the door just in time. The sound of him pounding on the door echoed through the house, his voice rising in anger and threats. I could hear his demands to be let in, promising consequences if I didn't comply. It was a nightmare unfolding before my eyes, and I felt utterly helpless. I quickly called emergency services, explaining the situation in frantic words, my voice trembling with fear. As I waited for help to arrive, I barricaded myself in a room, feeling the weight of terror bearing down on me. Every sound outside the door sent shivers down my spine. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The arrival of the police was a wave of relief, but the man had vanished into the night by the time they arrived. I explained what had happened, but without any identification or clear information, there wasn't much they could do. The incident left me shaking to the core. I installed extra security measures, checked the locks multiple times a day, and avoided answering the door to unexpected visitors. The sense of violation lingered long after that night, the fear of an unknown threat lurking in the safety of my home. I couldn't shake off the feeling of vulnerability, knowing that sometimes the scariest encounters are not with supernatural entities but with the unsettling intentions of people. It was a night of terror that made me question the sanctity of my home, leaving me haunted by the chilling reminder that danger could come knocking when least expected. The night was unusually dark, and my friends and I were driving back from a long road trip. We decided to take a break at a rest stop, just to stretch our legs and grab a quick snack. The place looked deserted, just a few dimly lit lampposts casting eerie shadows. As we pulled into the lot, there was this uncanny silence, an unsettling absence of any noise. I attributed it to the late hour, thinking everyone must be asleep. But there was something about that silence that sent a chill down my spine. We stepped out of the car, and that's when I noticed it. The atmosphere felt off, heavy with an unspoken dread. The usual bustle of a rest stop was missing. No chatter, no cars coming and going, just this unsettling stillness. We walked towards the vending machines, hoping to find something to snack on, but they were empty. Not a single snack left, not even a packet of chips. It felt odd, as if the place was abandoned in a hurry. My friend pointed out a small building nearby, probably the restroom. We hesitated but decided to check it out. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The flickering lights made the place seem almost haunting. The restroom was in shambles, the stalls were broken, and the sinks were stained. It looked like it hadn't been cleaned in ages. The air was musty, with a hint of something rotten. We decided to leave, the atmosphere too unnerving to linger. As we made our way back to the car, we noticed a figure standing at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the lamplight. It was unnaturally still, almost blending into the darkness. I couldn't make out any features, just this ominous silhouette. We hurriedly got into the car, trying to shake off the unease creeping over us. But then the headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. Panic set in as the car wouldn't start. It was as if something sinister was at play. My friend tried the radio, hoping to hear some music, something to break the eerie silence. But all we got was static, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to amplify the sense of impending doom. That figure we had seen earlier, it was closer now, just beyond the edge of the light. I could feel this growing sense of dread, a knot forming in my stomach. I wanted to leave, to get away from this place, but the car remained stubbornly still. We tried to call for help, but our phones had no signal, no bars whatsoever. The isolation of the rest stop felt suffocating, like we were trapped in a nightmare. Then, the figure started moving towards us, slow, deliberate steps. My heart raced as I realized we were in danger. There was something about its movement, this unhurried, calculated approach that sent shivers down my spine. We were trapped, sitting ducks in a deserted rest stop in the dead of night. Fear washed over us, and time seemed to stretch endlessly. We locked the doors, but that figure, it didn't seem affected. It kept getting closer, its features still hidden in the shadows. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation, to find a way out of this nightmare. Suddenly, the figure stopped, just inches away from the car. I could feel its presence, this oppressive force looming over us. It was as if it was studying us, observing our fear. I wanted to scream, to break free from this paralysis gripping me, but fear rendered me speechless. My friends were just as petrified, silent, and wide-eyed. And then, the figure turned and vanished into the darkness. The car started, the engine roaring to life. We wasted no time, speeding away from that rest stop. I was working the night shift, monitoring security cameras in this remote facility. It was one of those places that felt desolate even during the day, and at night, it seemed to become a different world altogether. I kept an eye on the screens, watching for any unusual activities, knowing I was the only one on duty. Everything was quiet until I noticed movement in one of the isolated areas on the cameras. It was supposed to be vacant, miles away from the main complex. At first, I dismissed it as a glitch or maybe an animal wandering around. But then, I saw it again, a shadowy figure lurking at the edge of the frame. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, trying to make out details. The figure was hunched over, moving slowly and deliberately. My heart quickened. There was something unnerving about the way it moved. I switched to a different camera to get a closer look, but the figure had vanished. I scanned the area, feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. Everything appeared quiet and undisturbed. But then, there it was again, a fleeting glimpse of movement, as if someone was deliberately avoiding the cameras. I focused all my attention on that area, feeling a growing sense of dread. Shadows danced across the screens, and my imagination started to play tricks on me. I was jumpy, convinced I was being watched from somewhere beyond those lenses. I picked up the radio to call for backup or alert someone, but static filled the airwaves. Panic clawed at me, realizing that I was truly alone in this isolated post with whatever was out there. The figure appeared again on one of the screens, closer this time, lingering just at the edge of the camera's range. My heart hammered in my chest as I decided to take action. I grabbed a flashlight and a bat, trying to quell my rising fear. I knew I had to investigate, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay put. Stepping outside, the air was thick with silence, broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing in the darkness. I navigated towards the area the figure had been spotted, my flashlight casting eerie shadows as I moved cautiously. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel my skin prickling with unease. The surroundings seemed almost alive, as if they were hiding something sinister. I reached the area but found nothing except for abandoned equipment and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I swept the flashlight around, scanning every corner, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. Just the vast emptiness of the night. Doubt crept in. Was I imagining things? Was it a trick of the light or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind? I decided to head back, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. But as I turned to leave, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight towards it, illuminating a dark figure standing just a few feet away. My breath caught in my throat as I faced the figure, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. The person, or whatever it was, stood completely still, staring at me with piercing eyes that seemed to glint in the light. I stumbled backward, my heart racing in terror. I tried to call out, but words failed me. There was something off about this figure, a sense of otherness that sent shivers down my spine. Before I could react or make sense of the situation, the figure turned and vanished into the darkness. I stood there, trembling, my mind racing with 1,000 questions and a primal fear that gnawed at my core. I hurried back to the security office, locking the door behind me, and I reached for the radio again, desperate for any connection. But the static persisted, refusing to yield to my pleas for help. I stayed in that room, watching the monitors, expecting that figure to reappear, but there was nothing. No signs of movement, no hint of the unsettling presence I had witnessed. As the night wore on, I tried to shake off the fear, rationalizing it as fatigue or perhaps a mind playing tricks. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inexplicable had occurred. When morning finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge, but I was also relieved to see the light of day. I reported what had happened to my supervisor, but the reaction was dismissive, a suggestion that it was likely an animal or my imagination. but I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a trick of the light or a mere illusion. There was something out there, something unexplainable and chilling, lurking in the darkness of that remote area. And that experience would haunt me for a long time to come, leaving me with an unshakable fear of what could exist beyond our understanding. I was driving late at night with a couple of friends, and we needed to refuel, so we spotted this gas station up the highway. It looked alright from a distance, but as we pulled in closer, things started to feel off. The station was eerily quiet, no signs of life around. I thought maybe it was just late, that they closed up early, but something about it didn't sit right. We needed gas, so we decided to check it out. Pulling up to the pumps, we realized there were no cars, no attendants, just an eerie silence. I tried to shrug it off, maybe it was just a slow night for them. But as I got out of the car, this shiver ran down my spine. It was too quiet, too still. The place looked old, worn down. Lights flickered above us, casting these unsettling shadows around. We walked towards the building, thinking someone might be inside, but the door creaked open as if it hadn't been touched in years. The inside was even more unsettling, dusty shelves, old magazines scattered, a layer of neglect everywhere. I called out, but there was no response. It was this eerie silence that sent a chill down my spine. We decided to grab what we needed and leave. But as we were about to head out, strange things started happening. The lights flickered more erratically, and we heard these odd creaks, like someone moving in the shadows. I felt this knot in my stomach, this sense of danger that I couldn't explain. I thought maybe it was just our nerves, playing tricks on us in this abandoned place. But then, things got weirder. Items on the shelf started moving on their own, falling off with no one near them. It was like the place had a life of its own, and it wasn't a friendly one. I felt this sense of impending doom, this urgency to get out, but we needed gas. As we made our way back to the pumps, the lights flickered faster, and this feeling of being watched settled over us. We hurried, trying to fuel up, but the pump didn't seem to be working, no gas flowing. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the station. We froze, exchanging terrified looks. We were alone, or so we thought. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, getting closer. Panic started to set in. We needed to leave, now. We ran to the car, this sense of urgency dragging us. I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. My heart raced as I kept trying, the sound of those footsteps getting louder. Finally, the car roared to life, and we peeled out of there, leaving that eerie gas station behind us. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I saw figures standing in the shadows of the station, watching us leave. It was this inexplicable encounter at that supposedly functional gas station that left us shaken, with this lingering fear that something sinister lurked within those abandoned walls. I took a babysitting job for a wealthy family, thinking it'd be an easy way to make some extra money. The house was grand, but something about it felt imposing, as if its walls held untold stories. The man of the house had made his fortune in the textile industry, and the air in the house carried an aura of opulence mixed with an unsettling tension. The kids were in bed, and I was in the living room, flipping through a magazine when I heard a loud crash, followed by voices shouting. Fear gripped me as I realized the sounds were coming from inside the house. Armed individuals burst in, their faces obscured by masks. They were shouting demands, asking for something the family didn't possess. I was frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. They herded us into a room, holding us hostage, me, the kids, and the parents. The air was thick with tension and fear. The parents tried to reason with the intruders, pleading for our safety, but the masked individuals seemed driven by something beyond reason. They were aggressive, threatening violence if their demands weren't met. The parents insisted they didn't have what the intruders were looking for, but the armed individuals didn't believe them. I felt powerless, helpless, as if the walls of the room were closing in on us. The children were terrified, clinging to their parents, and I tried my best to keep them calm, to reassure them that everything would be okay. But deep down, I was terrified too. The desperation in the intruders' voices, their menacing demeanor, it was clear they were willing to do anything to get what they wanted. Hours dragged by, the tension in the room escalating with each passing moment. I could hear the kids whimpering softly, their fear palpable. The intruders grew impatient, their threats turning more severe. They demanded immediate compliance or else they would take drastic measures. I felt a surge of fear, knowing that our lives were hanging by a thread. The parents were frantic, trying to negotiate, but it seemed futile. The intruders were unrelenting. Suddenly, a commotion outside drew the intruders' attention. There were sirens, flashing lights, a police presence outside the house. The intruders panicked, realizing they were surrounded. In the chaos, they grabbed what they could and fled, leaving us shaken and terrified. The sound of their hurried footsteps fading away felt like a lifeline. The police arrived and secured the house. They questioned us, and the parents explained that they didn't possess what the intruders were demanding. It seemed like a case of mistaken identity or a botched robbery. As the police conducted their investigation, I couldn't shake off the feeling of terror. The memory of those masked individuals, their aggression, the fear of not knowing if they'd return, it lingered like a nightmare. We were fortunate to come out physically unharmed, but the psychological trauma stayed with us. It was a night of terror, a stark reminder of the vulnerability that comes with simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The safety and security I took for granted shattered within those few hours, leaving behind a haunting experience I wish I could forget. It was getting late, and fatigue was creeping in as I navigated through the dimly lit streets. Then, I saw this figure at the side of the road, a hitchhiker with their thumb out. I felt this pang of sympathy, this desire to help someone in need. So, I pulled over, thinking I could offer a ride and some assistance. The hitchhiker seemed harmless enough, this weary-looking person with a backpack. I thought maybe they were just down on their luck, needing a lift to the next town. I felt this urge to help, this sense of doing a good deed. They got in, thanking me for stopping. We exchanged a few pleasantries, but as the ride went on, I noticed something was off. There was this uneasiness in their demeanor, this shifting glance that made me uneasy. I tried to engage in small talk, to ease the tension, but they seemed distant, almost evasive. I felt this growing sense of discomfort, this realization that I might have made a mistake. They asked if I could drop them off at a remote location, far from the main road. I hesitated, but I didn't want to leave them stranded. I felt this tug of war inside, this conflict between wanting to help and this feeling that something wasn't right. As we got closer to the spot they mentioned, this sense of dread washed over me. It was this desolate area, no signs of life around. I felt this overwhelming fear, this realization that I might be in danger. They asked me to pull over, and as I did, they suddenly turned towards me, this menacing look in their eyes. I felt this rush of panic, this fear gripping me. They demanded my belongings, this threatening tone that sent chills down my spine. I tried to reason with them, to talk them out of it, but they were insistent. I tried to hit the gas pedal and escape, but they grabbed onto me, this tight grip that paralyzed me with fear. I felt this suffocating terror, this sense of being completely helpless. They took my belongings and got out, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. I felt this overwhelming shock, this fear of what they might do next. I managed to drive away, this haunting encounter etched in my mind. But the fear lingered, this haunting memory of that chilling experience. Back when I was a teenager, I joined the cadets, and one summer, we had this camping trip planned. It was supposed to be a fun adventure, a chance to bond and learn survival skills. But things took a chilling turn that I'll never forget. We set up camp in a remote area, surrounded by thick woods. The air was crisp, the sky clear. It felt like the perfect setting for a camping trip. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. But then, we heard a strange sound in the distance, like branches snapping. At first, we dismissed it as some animal, but the sound grew louder, closer. It sent shivers down our spines. We huddled together, trying to brush off the unease. But then, one of us saw something moving in the darkness, silhouettes lurking beyond the trees. Fear gripped us. We weren't alone. There were figures out there, watching us. We debated whether to investigate or stay put. Some were curious, wanting to check it out, while others were terrified, fearing it could be dangerous. A group of us, eager to know what was out there, ventured cautiously into the woods. The night was eerily silent, the only sound our footsteps crunching on needles. But then, we saw them, figures standing in a circle, their faces hidden in the darkness. They didn't move or make a sound, just stood there, staring at us. Panic surged within us. We didn't know who or what they were. It was unsettling, the way they stood there, unmoving. We tried to call out, ask if they needed help, but they remained silent. The tension in the air was suffocating. Suddenly, they started chanting, low and haunting, in a language we couldn't understand. It felt sinister, sending chills down our spines. Fear consumed us. We turned and fled back to camp, not looking back, hearts pounding with terror. The night felt endless, the fear keeping us wide awake. Every sound made us jump, every rustle sending us into a panic. Morning couldn't come soon enough. We packed up swiftly, eager to leave that place behind. As we hiked out, the memory of those figures in the woods haunted us. It was a chilling encounter that stayed etched in our minds, leaving an unsettling feeling that we couldn't shake off. That camping trip, meant for camaraderie and learning, turned into a nightmarish experience. I worked the night shift at the hospital. The night was silent, the corridors dimly lit, and the rooms mostly quiet. But some nights, things happened that I couldn't explain. There was this one patient, Mr. Johnson, in room 213. He was recovering from surgery, but every time I walked by his room, he was awake, staring at the wall with these wide, unblinking eyes. He never acknowledged me, just kept his gaze fixed, which sent a chill down my spine. Then, there was Mrs. Carter in room 227. She'd been here for weeks, battling an infection. But she would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming about someone being in her room, despite it being empty. She was shaking, her eyes darting around, pleading for help, but there was no one there. It wasn't just the patients, it was the atmosphere that felt eerie at times. The lights flickered occasionally, and strange noises echoed down the empty halls. The whole place felt suffused with an eerie energy, making me feel on edge. One night, as I made my rounds, I heard murmurs coming from the empty room 240. I cautiously pushed the door open, expecting to find a patient in distress. But the room was empty, just an empty bed and a stillness that made my skin crawl. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just the air conditioning. Then, there was the patient in room 219, a young man recovering from an accident. He was usually quiet, but one night, he started talking to himself, whispering about someone watching him from the corner. I tried to calm him, but he just kept staring at the empty space, terror in his eyes. As the nights passed, these occurrences became more frequent. Patients would talk about seeing shadows or hearing whispers in the dark. Some even claimed they were being watched by unseen figures. I tried to dismiss it as hallucinations or paranoia, but the fear in their eyes felt real. One night, as I checked on a patient, I heard a faint, eerie melody echoing down the corridor. It sounded like an old music box, soft and haunting. I followed the sound, and it led me to the abandoned wing of the hospital, the part they closed off years ago. But the music was coming from there, drifting through the silent halls. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped into the darkness. The melody grew louder, guiding me deeper into the abandoned area. The air was thick, and an unsettling feeling settled over me. I followed the sound until it suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. That's when I heard a whisper, barely audible, right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty corridor, the dim light casting eerie shadows. I raced back to the main wing, shaken. I tried to convince myself it was a figment of my imagination, but that feeling of dread lingered. Something about that place felt wrong, like it held secrets I didn't want to uncover. The next night, I was attending to my duties when I heard footsteps coming from the closed-off area again. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there, listening intently, trying to make sense of it. But then, I saw shadows moving along the walls, shapes that shouldn't have been there. My breath hitched as I watched the shadows, feeling an inexplicable terror grip me. I wanted to leave, to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The footsteps drew closer, echoing louder with each passing moment. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw figures, silhouettes of people, standing at the edge of the abandoned wing. Their presence felt wrong, sending a shiver down my spine. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and I turned and fled, not looking back until I was back in the main corridor. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, my mind racing with questions and fear. What were those figures? Who or what was making those noises? I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the fear that I felt was too real. I wanted to leave, to quit my job, but I needed it. So, I forced myself to carry on, to keep my eyes straight, and to ignore the unsettling occurrences. But the fear lingered, making every sound, every whisper, seem like a haunting presence. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off about that hospital, about those empty corridors and the patients' whispers. I worked my shifts, keeping my head down, but the fear never left me, making every night shift a dreadful experience. Me and my girlfriend planned a weekend getaway to this cute little Airbnb, a tiny home tucked away in a quiet wooded area. The pictures online were inviting, showcasing a cozy place surrounded by nature. The host, Evelyn, seemed nice from our online interactions. She had positive reviews, so we were looking forward to our stay. When we arrived, Evelyn greeted us warmly, but something about her felt a bit off. She was overly attentive, almost too interested in our plans and itinerary for the weekend. She'd mentioned knowing our schedule for the next day, which struck me as strange, but I brushed it off. As the day rolled on, things started getting weirder. She would show up unannounced, claiming she wanted to ensure everything was all right. It felt like she was constantly watching us, our every move. At one point, she mentioned something that she could have only known if she was eavesdropping on us. Inside the tiny home, there were strange things. Some of our belongings seemed slightly rearranged, as if someone had been going through them. I tried to keep my composure, but my girlfriend was getting increasingly anxious. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence was too heavy, and the darkness outside felt suffocating. We heard footsteps around the house, but whenever we checked, there was no one. I thought I saw a shadow lurking outside our window, but when I looked again, it was gone. The next day, Evelyn asked questions about our personal lives that seemed way too probing. She seemed overly invested in our relationship, our jobs, and even our future plans. It was uncomfortable. The climax came when she entered the tiny home without knocking, claiming she needed to fix something, but everything seemed fine. We felt invaded, trapped in this space with someone who was becoming more than just an overly attentive host. Her interest turned into an unnerving obsession with us. I started noticing small details that were off. A hidden camera perhaps, or maybe a microphone. Paranoia began to creep in, and we felt like we were prisoners in this tiny home. We decided to leave early, making up an excuse about an emergency back home. But Evelyn insisted on knowing our exact plans, almost desperate for us to stay. Her insistence was frightening, and we hurriedly packed our things, feeling like we were escaping something ominous. Once we left, the relief was palpable, but the feeling of being watched lingered. We couldn't shake the chilling sense that Evelyn was still keeping tabs on us, even after we were miles away. It took a while for the eerie feeling to fade, but even now, the memory of that weekend remains etched in our minds. The unsettling realization that we were at the mercy of a host who crossed the line between hospitality and an unnerving obsession still sends shivers down my spine. My name is Billy, and I used to work the night shift at this hotel. You know, checking in guests, handling the paperwork, and all that. But this one night, things got real weird. I was going through the records, doing the usual audit, while I noticed something off. There were these discrepancies in the records, bookings that didn't add up. Rooms were marked as vacant, but I swear I remembered checking someone into those rooms earlier. It felt like something wasn't right, like someone was messing with the records. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I made a mistake, but then I noticed more odd things. Some guests were listed as checked out, but their belongings were still in the rooms. It was like they disappeared into thin air. I felt this chill creeping up my spine, like there was something shady going on. I checked the security footage, but it was all glitchy, like someone tampered with it. It made me real uneasy. Then, I started getting these calls from guests, complaining about strange noises in their rooms, like whispers or footsteps. They said they felt like they were being watched. It made my skin crawl. I tried to reassure them, saying it was probably just the old building settling or something. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. It was like the hotel had this eerie vibe, like there was something lurking in the shadows. As I went through the records, I found bookings for rooms that didn't exist. I checked the floor plans, and there was no such room number. It made no sense. I thought maybe it was a mistake, but the more I looked, the more these strange entries popped up. I tried to reach out to my manager, but I couldn't get through. It felt like I was on my own, dealing with this bizarre situation. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't abandon my shift, and there was this feeling like I had to figure out what was going on. I went up to the floors, checking the rooms myself. Some doors were locked from the inside, and when I knocked, there was no answer. It gave me this unsettling feeling, like someone was hiding in there. Then I stumbled upon this room, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. It was like a blank space on the floor plan, but there it was, a door where no door should be. I felt this dread sinking in. I tried the handle, and it was unlocked. The room was freezing cold, even though the air conditioning was off. There was this stale smell, like something rotten. It made my stomach turn. I stepped inside, and it was dark, pitch black. I felt my way around, trying to find a light switch. When I finally did, what I saw, I can't even explain. The room was empty, but it felt wrong. It was like the air was heavy with something sinister. I heard this whispering, real faint at first, like distant voices. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. Just this eerie silence. I wanted to get out of there, but I felt glued to the spot. It was like something was holding me back. The whispers grew louder, and I felt this overwhelming sense of fear, like I was in danger. I stumbled back, trying to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like it was stuck, like it didn't want to open. Panic started setting in, and I pounded on the door, calling for help, but no one came. I don't know how, but suddenly the door swung open, and I bolted out of there. I ran down to the lobby, trying to make sense of what happened. But when I checked the records again, the room wasn't there, like it never existed. I wanted to leave, get away from that place, but something kept pulling me back. I felt this lingering sense of dread, like whatever was in that room followed me. I quit that job soon after, but the fear, it stayed with me, haunting me like a nightmare that wouldn't end. I'd been trucking for years, driving through the night, moving cargo from one place to another. One evening, I was making good time, driving along a deserted stretch of highway when I saw something in the distance, a black head across the road. I slowed down, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when a group of masked individuals emerged from the shadows, surrounding my truck. My heart pounded. This was trouble. They forced me to stop, banging on the doors, yelling commands. They were armed, menacing, and I knew resisting would only make things worse. They ordered me out of the truck, threatening me with weapons. I complied, trying to stay calm, trying to figure out what they wanted. But they were aggressive, forceful, not giving any explanation. They blindfolded me, tied my hands behind my back, and shoved me into their vehicle. I didn't know what was happening, why they were doing this. Fear clenched my chest. I was at their mercy. We drove for what felt like hours, the sound of their whispered conversations unsettling. I couldn't make out their plans, their intentions, just the sense of impending danger. They finally stopped, pulled me out of the vehicle, and dragged me into this abandoned building. It was dark, damp, a sense of dread lingering in the air. They threw me into a room, still blindfolded, still tied up. I heard them talking, discussing something dark, something sinister. My mind raced with possibilities. I didn't know what they were planning. Hours passed, and I was alone in that room, blindfolded, bound, the uncertainty and fear gnawing at me. I couldn't escape, couldn't understand why they targeted me. Then they returned, their voices hushed but filled with a chilling determination. They forced me to stand, to follow their orders, threatening dire consequences if I resisted. They made me do unspeakable things, things that still haunt me to this day. I felt this sense of helplessness, this terror at the mercy of these assailants with their dark agenda. They seemed to relish in the fear they instilled, in the control they had over me. I tried to reason with them, to plead for my life, but they were ruthless, heartless. As the night dragged on, their intentions became clear. They wanted to send a message, to create chaos, and I was just a pawn in their game. Eventually, they left me alone again, still bound, still blindfolded, the sounds of their movements echoing through the empty building. I didn't know if I'd ever see daylight again. Hours turned into an eternity, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, they returned, their demands becoming more threatening, more sinister. But then, as abruptly as it started, they released me. They left me in that desolate place, battered, terrified, but alive. They vanished into the night, leaving me to wonder why they chose me, what their twisted agenda truly was. I've always lived a quiet life, content with my own company. But lately, things took a strange turn. It started a few weeks ago when the community leader, Mr. Wilson, started showing an unusual interest in my affairs. He'd drop by unannounced, offering help with odd jobs around the house. At first, I thought it was just neighborly concern, but as the visits became more frequent, I grew uneasy. Last night, it was different. It was darker outside, the usual tranquility of the night disrupted by an odd stillness. There was a knock on the door, and I hesitated before answering. It was Mr. Wilson, but there was something off about his demeanor. He seemed agitated, his eyes darting around, and his usual genial smile replaced by an unsettling grin. He started asking peculiar questions, probing into personal matters that were none of his business. His tone grew increasingly insistent, almost demanding. I tried to politely excuse myself, but he persisted, stepping closer until I could feel his breath on my face. It was uncomfortable, and I started feeling a sense of unease creeping in. The atmosphere grew tense, and I realized something was terribly wrong. His demeanor was no longer friendly, it was menacing. I could sense an underlying threat in his words, and a knot of fear formed in my stomach. My instinct screamed at me to get away, to protect myself from whatever was brewing beneath his unnerving facade. I tried to reason with him, to calm him down, but my efforts were futile. His behavior became more erratic, almost predatory. It felt like he was cornering me, closing the gap between us until I was backed against the wall. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was acting this way, but every fiber of my being screamed danger. I managed to slip past him, the adrenaline fueling my escape. I locked myself in a room, heart racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Fear pulsed through my veins as I heard him pacing outside, muttering incomprehensible words. The night dragged on, and I could hear him lurking around the house. I was terrified to call the authorities, afraid of what he might do if he realized I was trying to seek help. I felt trapped, isolated, and utterly vulnerable in my own home. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I considered making a run for it, but the thought of facing him in the dark sent shivers down my spine. The hours ticked by, each minute feeling like an eternity, and the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, couldn't shake off the overwhelming fear that had taken root in my mind. I listened intently, every sound amplified, each creak or rustle sending a jolt of terror through me. I felt like a prey being hunted by a predator. Eventually, the first light of dawn peeked through the curtains, and the house fell silent. I cautiously ventured out of the room, relieved to find no sign of Mr. Wilson. But the horror of that night lingered, a constant reminder of the chilling encounter that had turned my safe haven into a place of terror. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of being targeted by someone I had once trusted. It was unsettling, knowing that the community leader, a person of authority, had turned into a menacing figure lurking in the shadows. In the following days, I kept my doors locked, constantly looking over my shoulder. I avoided any encounters with Mr. Wilson, and his sudden absence from the neighborhood only heightened my unease. I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if I hadn't managed to evade his disturbing intentions that fateful night. The incident left me shaken, robbed me of the sense of security I once felt in my own home. It was a chilling reminder that danger could lurk where you least expect it, even within the supposedly safe confines of a quiet neighborhood. The fear that had gripped me that night refused to dissipate, a haunting memory of a chilling encounter that had turned my world upside down. Our group of friends had always been the adventurous sort. We yearned for unique experiences, far removed from the usual tourist traps. This time, we decided to charter a boat to a remote, uninhabited island. The prospect of pristine beaches, untouched jungles, and isolation had enticed us. Little did we know that this escapade would turn into a living nightmare. As we approached the island, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The island had a rugged beauty, but it also bore the aura of isolation. Our excitement outweighed our reservations as we disembarked onto the sandy shore, leaving the boat behind to give us the much-needed seclusion. Our days on the island were idyllic at first, with beachcombing, exploration, and campfires under the starlit sky. It was the stuff of dreams. But that dream quickly soured when we stumbled upon a modest, isolated hut nestled deep within the jungle. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate. The hut was surrounded by a lush garden, giving off an eerie sense of tranquility. The door was ajar, and as we peered inside, our joyous adventure took a chilling turn. The hut's inhabitant was a reclusive islander, a wiry, sun-worn man with an intensity in his eyes that sent shivers down our spines. He seemed to have no intention of welcoming us. His voice was gruff and laced with a warning, instructing us to leave and never return. We were shocked, but not willing to give up our precious escapes so easily. Ignoring his threats, we explained that we were merely explorers, meaning no harm. It was a mistake that would haunt us. The islander's demeanor darkened, his gaze locking onto us with a predatory intensity. He stepped closer, blocking the doorway and making it clear that we were not free to go. Panic set in as the reality of our situation became evident. We were trapped. Days turned into nights, and it became apparent that our isolated paradise had become our prison. The islander was deranged, convinced that we were invaders who sought to disrupt his solitary existence. Our pleas and negotiations fell on deaf ears. His demands were simple: obey or remain captive. We resorted to sneaking messages to the boat's crew, pleading for their assistance in secret. Each attempt was foiled, and the islander grew more menacing. He was aware of our every move, and we soon realized that our captor was not alone. His crude network of traps and alarms encircled us, and escape seemed impossible. The isolation, fear, and helplessness gnawed at our sanity. The islander was a master of psychological torment, toying with our minds. He recounted tales of past intruders who met gruesome fates. We were shown grisly mementos of their presence, personal items and trinkets stolen from the deceased. Our situation grew dire as we witnessed the lengths to which the islander would go to protect his solitude. His threats turned into violent actions. We were beaten, starved, and held hostage in that wretched hut. The island had turned from a dreamland into a macabre prison, and we feared it would be our tomb. Time seemed to blur, but we refused to give up hope. We hatched a daring plan, carefully biding our time, searching for any opportunity to escape. When the moment finally arrived, we seized it, overpowering the islander with our combined desperation. It was a struggle, one that left us battered and bruised, but we emerged victorious. Our liberation came at a cost, a heavy one that left us scarred both physically and emotionally. As we sped away from that forsaken island, our hearts were heavy with the knowledge of the darkness that had lurked beneath its tranquil facade. My parents had finally decided to have a date night after weeks of non-stop work. As a teenager, I was thrilled to have the house to myself for the evening. I had grand plans for a night of binge-watching my favorite TV shows and indulging in all the snacks I could find in the kitchen. The house felt eerily quiet as I settled in for the evening. I turned on all the lights to dispel any shadows that might play tricks on my imagination. It was just me, my dog Max, and a bag of potato chips. The sound of rain outside added to the cozy atmosphere, and I felt safe and snug on the couch. Hours passed as I watched episode after episode, and my parents' absence was almost forgotten. That was until I heard the faint sound of creaking from upstairs. Max, my usually fearless and boisterous German shepherd, had perked up, his ears alert. I muted the TV and strained to listen. It was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then, unmistakable footsteps echoed from above. My heart began to race. My parents had left me alone, and I was on edge. Is someone there? I called out, trying to sound confident. There was no response, just the sound of the rain drumming on the windows. I considered calling my parents. I didn't want to worry them on their date night. It was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me, I thought. I reluctantly resumed my show, but my unease lingered. Max remained vigilant, his eyes fixed on the staircase. That's when I heard a door creaking open upstairs. Panic seized me. There was no denying it now. Someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents, hoping they would see my message without being disturbed on their date. "I think someone's in the house," I typed, my fingers trembling. I waited, watching the screen, praying for a response. Minutes passed like hours, and still no reply. I couldn't wait any longer. I decided to call 911. As I spoke to the dispatcher, my voice trembled as I described the situation. They assured me that police were on their way and to stay on the line. With Max by my side, I crept to the hallway and glanced up the stairs. The faint glow of the upstairs hallway light revealed a dark figure standing at the top of the stairs. My blood ran cold. It was a man, a stranger, and he was just standing there, watching me. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I stifled a scream as I retreated back to the living room, clutching my phone. I whispered to the dispatcher that there was someone in the house, and they urged me to lock myself in a room. I dashed to the nearest bedroom, slammed the door shut, and barricaded it with whatever furniture I could find. Max was with me, barking furiously. My parents still hadn't replied to my messages, and my fear grew with each passing second. The sound of sirens approaching outside was a lifeline. The police had arrived. I explained my location to the dispatcher and told them I could hear the intruder moving around upstairs. Minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots coming down the stairs. The intruder was heading my way. My heart pounded, and I was ready to defend myself and Max with anything I could find. But then, I heard the voices of the police officers. They were shouting for the intruder to drop to the ground. There was a struggle, followed by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. It was over. The police burst into the room, their guns drawn, ensuring the intruder was apprehended. I felt a rush of relief, but my hands were still trembling. The man was arrested and taken away in the back of a police car. As the officers took my statement, my parents finally arrived home, shocked and horrified by what had occurred. It turned out that the intruder had broken in, thinking the house was empty, but had been startled by Max and my presence. I shuddered to think of what might have happened if I hadn't locked myself in the room and called the police. That night, I learned a valuable lesson about the importance of staying vigilant, even when you think you're safe at home. Driving the night bus had its quirks, but I had grown used to the solitude and the occasional odd passenger. It was approaching midnight, and I was on one of the final stretches of my usual late-night route, with only 6 more stops to go. The bus was empty, and the hum of the engine was the only sound that broke the silence. As I approached a dimly lit, isolated bus stop, I noticed 3 figures huddled on the bench. It was unusual to see anyone waiting at this hour, but I pulled over, thinking they were just late-night travelers trying to get home. I opened the doors, and the 3 men, all dressed in ragged clothes, stepped onto the bus. There was something unsettling about their appearance, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. They seemed disheveled, with wild, darting eyes that made me uneasy. Without a word, they made their way to the back of the bus, sitting in the last row. I kept my eye on them through the rearview mirror as I continued on the route. The atmosphere on the bus had shifted, and a sense of foreboding hung in the air. I tried to push aside my unease, chalking it up to late-night fatigue, but something about those 3 men gnawed at me. They whispered among themselves, and I couldn't make out their words, but their hushed tones sent shivers down my spine. As I pulled up to the next stop, a feeling of dread washed over me. I had a gut instinct that something was very wrong. I watched in the rearview mirror as one of the men got up from his seat and moved toward the front of the bus. He approached the fare box and stood there, not saying a word. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. The other two men remained in their seats, their eyes locked onto me with an unsettling intensity. I cleared my throat and asked, "Where are you headed?" The man at the fare box didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light of the bus. Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. These men weren't passengers, they had other intentions. I knew I had to act fast. Without hesitation, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and lurched the bus forward, sending the man stumbling backward. His two companions shouted in anger as the bus roared to life. I didn't stop. The road ahead stretched out in darkness, and I sped toward the next stop, praying that someone would be waiting there. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel as I tried to maintain control of the bus. As I pulled up to the next stop, I saw a lone figure waiting. I slammed on the brakes, and the bus screeched to a halt. Without waiting for the doors to fully open, I shouted, "Get on!" Quick! The passenger, a young woman, looked bewildered but didn't hesitate. She jumped onto the bus just as the three men from the back lunged forward, their faces contorted with rage. I slammed the doors shut, leaving the men outside, shouting and pounding on the bus. The woman and I locked eyes, both of us terrified by what had just transpired. I drove her to the next stop, where she could safely exit, and then continued on my route. My heart was still pounding, and the memory of those three men would haunt me for the rest of my days. I reported the incident to the authorities, but the men were never found. The police told me that they had likely been planning something sinister, and I had narrowly escaped a chilling encounter that could have ended in tragedy. From that night on, I drove the night bus with a constant sense of unease, always watching the rearview mirror, afraid that those three men might return. I was used to late night shifts as a room service attendant at the Grand Plaza Hotel. The place had its quirks, but it paid the bills. It was an ordinary evening, and I had an order for room 312, a standard guest room on the third floor. I gathered the tray with a covered plate and a bottle of wine and headed up in the dimly lit elevator. As I approached room 312, I could hear muffled sounds from behind the door. Soft, yet unnerving, like someone whispering. I knocked politely, announcing myself as room service. After a brief pause, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room with heavy curtains drawn to block any outside light. The guest who opened the door was a man, middle-aged, with a haggard expression and disheveled hair. He was wearing a wrinkled suit, and it was evident that he had seen better days. I greeted him with a polite smile and began setting the tray down on the table, my eyes briefly scanning the room. It was filled with a pungent smell of stale cigarette smoke. The man's gaze was fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. I could feel his eyes, cold and piercing, boring into me. There was an awkward silence as I uncovered the plate and presented his meal. The room was eerily quiet, and the only sound was my own breathing. As I offered the wine, he reached out to take it, his hand trembling slightly. He spoke in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "You know, I'm not usually one for small talk, but you seem different from the others." I forced a polite chuckle, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "Different? How so?" I asked, though I had a feeling I didn't want to know his answer. He leaned in closer, his breath stinking of alcohol and something else, something more sinister. "You see, I have this gift," he whispered, as if sharing a forbidden secret. "I can see things." The truth, you know. A chill ran down my spine. The room felt colder, despite the warmth outside. I couldn't move, mesmerized by the strange man's unsettling eyes. He continued, "You have secrets, my friend. We all do. But some secrets are darker than others." I struggled to maintain my composure, trying to finish my service as quickly as possible. I couldn't get out of that room fast enough. As I bid him goodnight and headed back down to the elevator, the feeling of dread lingered. What had I just encountered? That night, I couldn't sleep. The strange man's words echoed in my mind. His uncanny ability to see something hidden, something darker, filled me with an unsettling sense of paranoia. I questioned every action, every decision I ever made. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and doubt. The next evening, I received another order for room 312. Dread filled my veins, but I couldn't refuse. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, tray in hand, and hesitated before knocking on that door again. This time, it was the smell that hit me first. A rancid odor, stronger than the cigarette smoke. My heart pounded as I knocked, and the door creaked open once more. The man's eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto mine. There was a wicked grin on his face. As I cautiously entered the room, I couldn't help but glance at the bed. There, I saw the source of the rancid smell. A pool of dark, crimson liquid had soaked through the sheets and dripped onto the floor. A sense of horror washed over me. The man gestured to the tray, but I couldn't focus on it. I couldn't ignore the sinister tableau before me. My instincts told me that I needed to leave, that I needed to get out of there as fast as I could. But the man leaned closer, his voice a sinister whisper. "You know what I see, don't you?" "The truth, my friend." I managed to mutter something about needing to check on another guest and fled the room. Once I was safely out of the hotel, I called the police. The authorities arrived and discovered a gruesome scene in room 312. It turned out that the man had a history of violent crimes and had been on the run. He'd been using the hotel as a hiding place, and I had unwittingly walked into his terrifying world. That chilling encounter haunted me for years. It was a nightmare I couldn't escape. The Grand Plaza Hotel, once a place of mundane late-night work, had transformed into a house of horrors. It reminded me that darkness often lurked where you least expected it, hidden behind the veneer of ordinary life. As the rain relentlessly pounded the city outside, I found myself immersed in a wave of nostalgia, reminiscing about a chilling encounter from my past, a night when a seemingly normal trip to Blockbuster Video turned into a nightmare. The memories had faded over the years, but that night remained etched in my mind. It was a rainy night, much like the one outside my window now. I was in my late teens, seeking refuge from the downpour, and the local Blockbuster store seemed like the perfect hideaway. The familiar scent of popcorn and the hum of fluorescent lights welcomed me as I stepped inside, the rain-soaked wind still fresh on my skin. I strolled through the narrow aisles, my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. The flickering light from the ceiling cast eerie shadows on the rows of DVD cases. It was a trip down memory lane, and I was lost in a world of cinematic possibilities. That's when I saw him, an enigmatic figure standing by the horror section. His silhouette was barely discernible in the dim light, but something about his presence sent shivers down my spine. He seemed out of place, as if he didn't belong in the aisles of Blockbuster. I tried to dismiss my unease, assuming he was just another customer, but the way he stared at the horror movie covers with an intensity that bordered on obsession was unsettling. I moved on to the new releases section, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The rain outside had intensified, and the distant sound of thunder echoed through the store, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As I browsed the DVDs, I couldn't help but glance back at the strange man. He was still there, his eyes locked onto the horror section. It was as if he was in a trance, his mind lost in the world of gory films and macabre tales. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to approach him, partially to break the awkward silence that had fallen over the store. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. "Hey," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Looks like you're a fan of horror, huh?" The man turned to me, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. His eyes met mine, and they were piercing, a deep shade of gray that seemed to see right through me. "Yes," he replied, his voice a soft whisper. "Horror is my life." I forced a smile, but his response sent a chill down my spine. There was something off about him, something that didn't quite fit the setting. We struck up a conversation, and he seemed knowledgeable about horror movies, discussing obscure titles and directors I had never heard of. But the more he spoke, the more my unease grew. There was a sinister edge to his words, a darkness that couldn't be ignored. He spoke of gruesome scenes and gore with a disturbing enthusiasm, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. It was as if he reveled in the darkest aspects of the genre, finding a twisted joy in the macabre. As the conversation continued, I couldn't help but feel trapped. The man's intensity had a suffocating effect, and I found it increasingly difficult to break away. It was as if his words held me captive, and the distant rumble of thunder seemed to underscore the growing tension. Eventually, I managed to extricate myself from the conversation, offering a feeble excuse about needing to pick out a movie and make my way to the counter. The store had grown eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional drip of rainwater from the ceiling. But as I made my way to the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, the man from the horror section. He trailed behind me, his eyes never leaving my back. Panic surged through me, and I quickened my pace, my heart racing as I approached the store's entrance. The rain outside had intensified, and the downpour masked the sound of my hurried footsteps. I burst through the door and into the deluge, my clothes instantly soaked by the relentless rain. But I didn't care. I needed to escape from the man who had haunted the aisles of Blockbuster. As I rushed down the sidewalk, I couldn't help but glance back at the store. The man stood in the doorway, his hood now removed, revealing a face etched with madness. His eyes locked onto mine, and the sinister smile on his lips sent a shiver down my spine. I ran through the rain-soaked streets, my heart pounding, the chilling encounter at Blockbuster forever etched in my memory. The rain that had once been a source of comfort had become a torrential downpour, as if the elements themselves conspired to mirror the terror I had felt inside the store. My life had been simple, peaceful even, as I found peace in my remote cabin nestled deep in the woods. The tranquility of nature had always been my closest companion, providing me with the serenity I had longed for. But that solitude came to an abrupt and nightmarish end one evening. It started with a subtle feeling of being watched. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination, but the unease gnawed at me. As the days passed, the sensation intensified, growing more sinister with each glance over my shoulder. I knew I wasn't alone. One evening, as I gazed out my cabin window into the darkened forest, I saw a figure among the trees. It was motionless, shrouded in a mask that concealed its identity. Panic surged through me as our eyes met, and then, with the speed of a shadow, the stalker vanished into the night. I called the police, but in the remote wilderness, their response was slow, and when they arrived, they found nothing but the deafening silence of the woods. There was no evidence, no trace of the intruder. Night after night, the masked stalker returned. I could hear their silent presence lurking among the trees, watching, waiting. The torment was relentless, and sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. My nerves frayed as each night passed. In the depths of despair, I decided to confront the stalker. Armed with a flashlight and my trembling resolve, I ventured into the forest. The woods closed in around me, and every rustle of leaves was a threat. The confrontation was chilling. I found myself face to face with the masked figure, their presence suffocating. They never spoke a word, but their eyes bore into my soul. Desperation coursed through me, and I realized I was dealing with someone who was relentless and unhinged. My resolve shattered, and I fled back to the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The stalker didn't follow, and when I peered out the window, they were gone, leaving me with nothing but the chilling certainty that they would return. With every passing day, the torment intensified. I barricaded myself in the cabin, fearing the impending night. Sleep deprived and consumed by paranoia, I knew I had to take action. I gathered my belongings and left my cherished cabin behind. I sought refuge in a city, but even there, the presence of the masked stalker lingered in my mind. The experience haunted me, and the peace I had once known was forever shattered. Though I escaped the remote cabin and the sinister figure that had tormented me, the scars of that nightmare clung to my soul. I never learned the identity of the stalker, but their silent, masked presence would forever haunt my dreams, a testament to the terrors that can hide within the solitude of a wilderness. The day began like any other hiking trip with my group of friends. A bright sun overhead, the scent of pine trees in the crisp mountain air, and our backpacks filled with sandwiches and water bottles. We were on the lookout for adventure, and oh, we found it, though not in the way we expected. We had set out on a popular trail in the vast wilderness, a place we'd explored countless times. Our laughter echoed through the woods, a testament to our camaraderie. We followed the trail, deep into the heart of the forest, chatting and savoring the beauty of the untamed landscape. As the sun started its descent, casting long shadows over the trees, we realized we had ventured farther than ever before. We were in uncharted territory, but curiosity propelled us forward. That's when we stumbled upon it. An eerie silence enveloped us as we came upon a gruesome discovery that sent shivers down our spines. A corpse suspended high in a tree, swaying gently in the breeze. The sight was jarring, to say the least. The lifeless body, still fresh enough to display the signs of a violent end, dangled from a rope. The branches above seemed impossibly sturdy, raising more questions than they answered. How had the body been hoisted so high? It was a scene that defied explanation. We approached with a mixture of dread and disbelief, our voices hushed, as if speaking any louder might awaken the horrors that surrounded us. There was no sign of anyone else nearby, no clues to explain the chilling spectacle before us. The hiker's face was distorted in a final grimace, and his eyes stared blankly into the abyss. His clothes were tattered, and his skin a sickly shade of pale. I had seen death before, but this was something entirely different, something out of a nightmare. One of our group, a paramedic, examined the body, searching for any signs of life or an attempt to stage the scene. But there were no wounds, no signs of foul play, just the horrific reality of a man suspended in a tree, his life extinguished. We made the difficult decision to cut the body down, to give this poor soul a proper burial. The process was a macabre and somber one, marked by the silent weight of what we had witnessed. It was a task none of us could have anticipated, nor would we ever forget. As night fell, we set up camp nearby, our campfires glow casting eerie shadows across the surrounding trees. None of us could shake the unease that had settled in our hearts. Our conversations were hushed, and the forest around us felt different now, more alive with secrets. We notified the police, who arrived at the scene. The investigation that followed only deepened the mystery. There were no missing person reports that matched the description of the hiker, no evidence of how he had met such a gruesome end. As we made our way back to civilization, the memories of that haunting discovery lingered. We couldn't explain what we had encountered, and it haunted our thoughts for years to come. We had gone in search of adventure and found a nightmare. Back in 2015, my friend Jamie and I decided to embark on a backpacking adventure through Europe. We heard about this small, forgotten village nestled deep in the Romanian Carpathian Mountains. The place was called Vasilor, and rumors suggested it had been abandoned for years. Curiosity drove us to include it in our itinerary. Our journey led us through winding mountain roads, and eventually, we stumbled upon the outskirts of the village. The sight that greeted us was eerie: cottages, overgrown gardens, and cobblestone streets that seemed untouched by time. The air was heavy with silence, and a thick mist clung to the landscape. Excitement mingled with unease as we ventured further into Vasilor. No sooner had we taken a few steps than we felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. It was as though unseen eyes followed our every move. But we shrugged it off, thinking our imagination was getting the best of us. We explored an old church first, its interior filled with ancient, religious relics. Jamie decided to snap a photo when he suddenly froze, staring at the camera screen. "Look at this," he muttered, showing me the image. In the photo, amidst the religious icons, there was a blurry figure of a villager who seemed out of place, seemingly staring right at us. We decided to continue, pressing further into the village. As we approached a decaying, two-story house, we heard a distant, melodic chant. The sound grew louder, and we realized it was coming from the village square, where a group of villagers had gathered. What struck us as odd was the way they seemed to be celebrating, though the village appeared deserted when we arrived. Their clothes, a strange blend of old and new, made them look like they had stepped out of the past. The tension was palpable as we hesitated about whether to approach the group. Their faces were obscured, a sea of white masks with crude, smiley expressions. The unnerving chants grew louder, and our sense of dread deepened. Before we could make a decision, one of the villagers noticed us and pointed us out to the others. A chill ran down my spine as they turned their collective attention toward us. Their expressions remained concealed by the sinister masks, but their movements conveyed a malevolent intent. We didn't wait to see what they had in mind, bolting back towards the church. The villagers pursued us with alarming speed and stamina. Our hearts pounded as we raced through the streets, and it became apparent that these seemingly ordinary villagers were far from harmless. They were gaining on us, and there was no choice but to hide. We ducked into an abandoned cottage, barricading ourselves behind the creaking wooden door. It didn't take long for the villagers to discover our hiding spot, and soon they were banging on the door with an eerie determination. It was a harrowing standoff, and I was grateful for the sturdy old were keeping them at bay. However, it was only a matter of time before they overcame our barricade. Jamie and I knew we needed a plan, and fast. As we brainstormed, a crash echoed from outside, and the banging stopped. We exchanged bewildered glances and decided to risk a peek. What we saw was astonishing. Another group of people, armed with sticks and logs, had come to our aid. They fought off the menacing villagers, giving us the chance to escape. We sprinted out of the cottage and joined our unexpected saviors. Their leader, an elderly woman with a stern but kind face, explained that the villagers of Vasilor were dangerous, hiding in plain sight for generations. They revealed that the place wasn't abandoned, but that it was occupied by a secretive cult who lured curious tourists like us. With the help of our new allies, we managed to escape the clutches of the villagers and find our way back to safety. It was a heart-pounding ordeal that haunted our memories long after we left Vasilor. The experience in that supposedly abandoned village had shaken us to our core, teaching us the true meaning of fear. It was a nightmare come to life, and it made us appreciate the safety of the world outside its sinister cobblestone streets. Jamie and I never stopped wondering about the secrets of Vasilor, but one thing was certain: we had no intention of ever returning to those haunted mountains. Our adventure had changed us, leaving an indelible mark on our souls and a chilling story to share. A few years back, I was working as a recovery driver, a job that often took me into the darkest hours of the night. One rainy night, my phone buzzed with an urgent call. A vehicle had broken down on the outskirts of town, and I was dispatched to assist. As I drove through the downpour, my mind raced with thoughts of what could have gone wrong. Little did I know, this would be a night I would never forget. Arriving at the scene, I found a group of 5 men huddled around a disabled vehicle. Their behavior was strange, to say the least. They looked jittery, their eyes darting around as though they were on the brink of a secret. I couldn't help but sense something was amiss. The vehicle had a flat tire, a mundane issue that shouldn't have warranted such unease. I decided to get to work, determined to change the tire and get these men back on the road. As I knelt down, the rain pouring down on me, the men remained oddly silent, observing my every move with intensity. I pulled the spare tire from the trunk and began to assess the situation. But as I opened the trunk, I was met with a sight that sent a bolt of terror down my spine. There, before me, lay a lifeless body wrapped in a tarp. The men had a corpse in their trunk. Shock and fear consumed me as I stumbled back, my heart racing. The men maintained their eerie silence, their expressions devoid of emotion. I knew I had to act quickly, that my life was in danger. I pretended to have not seen the body, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. I continued to work on the tire, my hands trembling. The rain continued to fall, a symphony of dread that seemed to mock my predicament. My mind raced with questions. Who was the deceased person in the trunk? Why were these men traveling with a body? And what were their intentions? With the new tire in place, I finished the job and informed the men they were ready to go. Their silence remained unbroken, but the weight of their secret bore down on me like a suffocating fog. As they departed into the rainy night, I was left alone with my thoughts and the chilling memory of what I had discovered. I couldn't help but wonder what sinister events had led to this night. The rain washed away any evidence of their presence, but the nightmare was etched into my memory. I reported the incident to the authorities, who launched an investigation into the mysterious travelers. The truth behind the body in the trunk would eventually come to light, but the horror of that night would forever haunt my dreams. The rain that had fallen relentlessly that night served as a symbol of the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary of situations. My job as a recovery driver had taken me to the edge of a real-life nightmare, and the memory of that chilling encounter would stay with me for the rest of my days. Being a delivery driver for Dave's Burgers the last 6 months was an easy job. The routine of taking orders, loading up the car, and dropping off meals to hungry customers rarely involved anything beyond navigating city streets. That all changed on a chilly Friday night. I noticed the first inkling of trouble during a delivery to a quiet suburban neighborhood. As I stepped out of the car, I caught sight of a shadowy figure standing beneath a street lamp, their features obscured by the darkness. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, triggering it to the usual jitters of working after dark. The feeling of unease intensified with each subsequent delivery. It wasn't just a single figure anymore. It seemed like a different person was watching me at each stop. Their distant gazes and furtive movements set my nerves on edge, but I reasoned that it could be a coincidence, a string of curious onlookers. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. I became acutely aware of the headlights trailing me, switching lanes when I did, maintaining a steady distance. Paranoia gnawed at my thoughts, and the lines between coincidence and something more sinister blurred. By the time I reached the last delivery on my list, a palpable sense of dread hung in the air. The address led me to an isolated house at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods. The headlights behind me lingered at the entrance, their occupants hidden in the shadows. I approached the house cautiously, the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes echoing in the silence. As I handed the bag to the customer, a sense of urgency overcame me. I needed to leave, to escape the disconcerting gaze of the mysterious followers. As I retraced my steps to the car, a rustle in the woods caught my attention. The shadows seemed to come alive, figures emerging from the darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the keys, the distant sound of footsteps quickening. The engine roared to life, and I sped away from the ominous scene, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. The figures, now visible in the glow of the taillights, sprinted after me. Fear clenched my chest as I navigated the winding roads, the relentless pursuit showing no signs of abating. I contemplated calling the police, but uncertainty held me back. What would I tell them? A group of people was following me? It sounded absurd, even to my own ears. Instead, I focused on getting home, on losing the unnerving pursuers. The chase led me through deserted streets and darkened alleys, a relentless pursuit never faltering. Thoughts of the unknown assailants and their motives raced through my mind. Were they after me personally, or was I just an unwitting target? I dared not lead them to my home, opting instead to take convoluted routes through the city. The adrenaline-fueled chase felt like a nightmare, the line between reality and terror blurred in the rearview mirror. My phone buzzed with messages from the unknown numbers, each one more cryptic than the last. It became clear that this was more than a random encounter. Someone had orchestrated this pursuit with intent, and I was the unwitting protagonist in a twisted game. Fear and paranoia gripped me, my imagination conjuring sinister scenarios that defied rational explanation. Desperation set in as I contemplated seeking refuge in a crowded public place. The chase continued, my pursuers seemingly undeterred by the bustling city streets. I couldn't shake the feeling that their relentless pursuit was a prelude to something far more sinister. With a surge of adrenaline, I decided to confront them directly. I pulled into an empty parking lot, the headlights behind me slowing to a stop. As the figures emerged from their vehicles, my heart pounded in my ears. Their faces, once shrouded in darkness, were now illuminated by the harsh glow of the streetlights. To my astonishment, they weren't strangers but people from my past, former colleagues, acquaintances, and even distant relatives. Their expressions ranged from stern determination to twisted grins. A wave of confusion washed over me as they revealed a shared motive, revenge for perceived wrongs, imagined slights, and ancient grievances. I realized then that this wasn't a random act but a calculated vendetta. The pursuit was a manifestation of their collective anger, a nightmarish retaliation that left me shaken to the core. As they closed in, I understood that the real horror was not in the pursuit itself, but in the darkness that lurked within the hearts of those I had unwittingly wronged. The nightmare ended with their menacing presence and the eerie stillness that followed. The forest had become my refuge, a chaotic sanctuary veiled by the shadows of towering trees. I was on the run, a fugitive, my every step weighted by the fear of pursuit. My tent, hidden amidst the dense foliage, was a meager haven, but dwindling supplies pressed me deeper into the wilderness. As hunger gnawed at my stomach, desperation became my guide, leading me towards an unexpected encounter that would strip away the illusion of safety. One early morning, as I trekked through the underbrush, a plume of smoke twisted through the treetops. A distant cabin, nestled in the heart of the forest, beckoned like a mirage of salvation. A cautious optimism kindled within me, and I cautiously approached, hoping to find sustenance to prolong my desperate escape. The closer I ventured, the more details emerged of a rustic cabin, weathered by time, its chimney billowing the smoke that had lured me. My footsteps, muffled by fallen leaves, betrayed no sign of my arrival. As the cabin loomed before me, a strange sense of foreboding tightened its grip. Summoning a semblance of courage, I rapped gently on the door, an echo reverberating through the stillness of the forest. A shadow flickered behind the frosted glass, a silhouette, a silent observer of my intrusion. The door creaked open, revealing a man whose eyes bore into mine with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. His withered face betrayed no emotion, a stoic mask that concealed a myriad of secrets. I stammered, concocting a tale of a lost hiker, hoping to divert suspicion. The man's gaze remained unwavering, a piercing scrutiny that saw through my feeble facade. Without uttering a word, he invited me inside, his gesture carrying an unspoken weight. The interior was dimly lit, the aroma of burning firewood mingling with the mustiness of aged timber. Unease festered as I observed my surroundings. An array of hunting trophies adorned the walls, the lifeless eyes of the taxidermy creatures reflecting the eerie ambience. My attempt to blend in faltered, every corner whispered of a sinister history, hidden behind the facade of rustic simplicity. The man, an enigma draped in worn flannel, broke the silence with a gravelly voice that echoed through the confined space. He spoke of the forest's tales, its ancient secrets entwined with the roots that anchored the cabin. An unsettling realization dawned: the man was no stranger to the shadows that clung to the wilderness. As conversation unfolded, a cold sweat traced my spine. His questions were veiled interrogations, probing into the recesses of my fabricated story. I felt like prey ensnared in a hunter's trap, the illusion of safety crumbling with each passing moment. Panic clawed at my chest as I wrestled with the decision to flee or feign camaraderie. The man's demeanor shifted, a subtle menace tainting the air. His eyes, once unreadable, harbored a darkness that mirrored the depths of the forest itself. Abruptly, he rose, beckoning me towards a door that led to the cabin's bowels. My heart thundered as I hesitated, the unknown awaiting me beyond that threshold. The room revealed a trove of horrors, shackles, chains, and tools that spoke of unspeakable acts committed in the name of a twisted solitude. The man's true nature unfurled before me, a predator hidden behind the guise of a recluse. The realization ignited a primal instinct, the fight or flight response that surged through my veins. Adrenaline propelled me towards the exit, my senses heightened to the looming threat. The forest, once a realm of escape, became a labyrinth fraught with peril. My breath synchronized with the rhythm of my pounding footsteps, the pursuit echoing through the dense thicket. Every branch that snapped beneath my feet reverberated with the urgency of survival. The canopy above, thick with interwoven branches, veiled the moonlight, casting in ominous darkness. The predator's steps echoed relentlessly, a haunting symphony of pursuit. My mind raced, mapping an escape route through the labyrinth of trees, the boundaries of safety ever elusive. As the forest swallowed my fleeting silhouette, the man's bellowed threats hung in the air. The underbrush became my ally, masking my movements as I weaved through the intricate dance of shadows. Panic and determination intermingled, the thin line between predator and prey blurring in the suffocating confines of the woods. Exhaustion threatened to betray me, my labored breaths a symphony of vulnerability. A glimmer of moonlight guided me towards a clearing, a sanctuary bathed in silver luminescence. With every ounce of strength, I willed my legs forward, the rhythm of pursuit fading into the distance. The evening was settling in, and the house was quiet, just me, alone, in the comfort of my home. It felt peaceful at first, the familiar silence wrapping around me like a blanket. But as darkness draped over the neighborhood, a sense of unease began to creep in. That unease wasn't unfounded. The doorbell echoed through the house, shattering the quietude. I hesitated before peering through the peephole, and my heart skipped a beat. There she stood, Miss Thompson, the former babysitter from years ago. Her sudden appearance sent a jolt of unease through me. I remembered her from my childhood, a reliable babysitter, but there was something off about her now. She looked anxious, her eyes darting around as if expecting trouble. Reluctantly, I opened the door, hoping to alleviate whatever emergency she claimed to have. She appeared distressed, fumbling with her words, explaining that her car had broken down nearby, and she needed to use the phone urgently. A dubious excuse, but I let her in, feeling a pang of guilt leaving her stranded outside. As she entered, Her nervous energy seemed to fill the room, infusing the air with a palpable tension. I offered her the phone, but she declined, insisting she needed to use the restroom. Her behavior was erratic, and a sense of discomfort lingered as I led her down the hall. Minutes ticked by, and a creeping feeling of anxiety gnawed at me. I started to question her motives. Why was she really here? Her emergency story didn't add up, and her presence felt suffocating. I debated calling for help, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. When she emerged from the restroom, her demeanor had shifted. She appeared calmer but had a strange intensity in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to make small talk, but the conversation felt forced and strained. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for something, her gaze lingering on the family photos with an unsettling fixation. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense, the air thick with unspoken apprehension. I was on edge, a growing sense of dread seeping into every fiber of my being. The longer she stayed, the more uncomfortable I felt in my own home. I attempted to gently hint that it was getting late, hoping she would take the cue to leave, but she didn't budge. Instead, she lingered, making me feel more uneasy with every passing moment. Her presence felt intrusive, invasive almost, and a knot of fear tightened in my stomach. The night stretched on, the clock ticking away each agonizing second. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but her presence had me on edge. I kept making excuses, subtly hinting that I needed to turn in for the night, but she remained stubbornly rooted in the living room. As the clock struck midnight, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She started pacing, muttering to herself in hushed tones that sent shivers down my spine. I felt trapped, the walls of my own home closing in on me, suffocating me with fear and anxiety. Suddenly, she turned to me, her gaze piercing, and started speaking in a frantic, almost manic tone. Her words were disjointed, a mix of apologies, cryptic messages, and veiled threats that sent my heart racing. My mind spun with questions, trying to decipher her intentions, but nothing made sense. I tried to maintain composure, attempting to coax her to leave, but she seemed fixated on something that I couldn't comprehend. Her presence had become suffocating, an ominous cloud hanging over my home. The situation escalated when she made veiled references to events from my childhood, events that no stranger should have known. Fear gripped me, the realization sinking in that this wasn't an ordinary visit. It was something darker, something deeply unsettling. The night felt endless, my home becoming a prison, trapping me with this intruder whose intentions were shrouded in mystery. I felt vulnerable, helpless against her unnerving behavior. I managed to reach for my phone, my trembling fingers dialing for help. But just as I was about to press the call button, she lunged forward, grabbing my arm in a vice-like grip, her eyes wild with desperation. Panic coursed through me, adrenaline flooding my veins as I struggled to break free. My heart raced, each beat drumming the urgency of a situation. With a surge of strength, I wrenched myself away, stumbling backward in terror. In a flurry of movement, I bolted for the door, my heart pounding against my rib cage. I dashed outside, not daring to look back until I reached safety. Gasping for breath, I frantically dialed the authorities, relaying the chilling ordeal that had unfolded in my own home. The authorities arrived swiftly, but Miss Thompson was nowhere to be found. They searched the area thoroughly, offering reassurances, but the sense of terror lingered long after she vanished into the night. I'd been driving trucks for ages, long, lonely stretches of road, nothing unusual. But this night was different. It was unsettling. I picked up a hitchhiker, a guy who looked like he needed a lift. He seemed ordinary, a little quiet maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary. We chatted a bit as we drove, nothing too deep, just passing the time. But then he got this strange look in his eyes, like he was lost in thought or something. It made me uncomfortable, this sudden change in demeanor. I pulled into a gas station to refuel and stretch my legs. But when I turned to talk to the guy, he was gone. Vanished into thin air. I thought I was losing it. Maybe he had slipped away while I wasn't looking, but there was no way. I would have heard the door or seen him walking away. I searched around the station, but he was nowhere in sight. It was like he had never been there, like I'd imagined the whole thing. I couldn't wrap my head around it. It was chilling, this mysterious disappearance that made no sense. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he hitched another ride or something, but that feeling of unease lingered. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to reappear out of nowhere. I got back in the truck, heart racing, hands trembling. I felt this sense of dread creeping in, this fear that I couldn't shake off. I drove on, but every shadow, every noise, made me jump. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting him to materialize there. I stopped at another gas station further down the road, trying to calm my nerves. But that's when things took a turn for the worse. I saw him, or at least I thought I did, standing in the distance, watching me. I blinked, and he was gone again. It was impossible. It had to be a trick of the mind. I hurried back to the truck, feeling this creeping paranoia, this fear that I couldn't shake off. I locked the doors, checking and rechecking, but that feeling of being watched lingered. I drove faster, trying to put distance between me and whatever was haunting me. But then, I saw him again, in my rearview mirror, standing on the side of the road, just watching. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was racing, and I felt this panic rising inside me. I drove and drove, not stopping until I reached a crowded rest area. I tried to explain what happened to the authorities, but it sounded crazy, like I'd lost my mind. They searched the area, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I couldn't sleep that night, haunted by that eerie encounter, that hitchhiker who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. I kept thinking I was being watched, that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Even now, I can't shake off the fear, the uncertainty of what happened that night. That hitchhiker, his mysterious disappearance, and the lingering feeling that something wasn't right, something beyond explanation, still terrifies me. Vacations are usually a time for relaxation, but my recent trip to a tropical paradise turned into a chilling encounter I'll never forget. I'd always been fascinated by shipwrecks, so when I saw the opportunity to book a diving experience to explore one off the coast, I jumped at the chance. Little did I know that this adventure would become a nightmarish descent into the depths of human greed. As I arrived at the dive center, I was greeted by our diving instructor, Sarah, who seemed friendly and experienced. A small group of us had signed up for the dive, and we were all excited about the prospect of uncovering hidden treasures from the ocean's depths. The shipwreck was said to be a rich source of historical artifacts, and rumors had it that it might even contain a lost chest of gold. The dive began like any other, with breathtaking coral reefs and colorful marine life to explore. We descended deeper, and as the shipwreck came into view, I couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. The old vessel lay in eerie silence, its masts tangled with seaweed, a haunting relic of the past. Our group carefully explored the ship's interior, discovering rusted cannons, pottery, and other remnants of its cargo. It was as thrilling as I'd hoped, and I couldn't have been happier. That is until we stumbled upon a cache of artifacts unlike anything I'd ever seen. The rumors of gold suddenly seemed all too real as we found a chest filled with ornate, glistening trinkets. Before we could react, a series of lights emerged from the gloom. Our flashlights revealed a rival group of divers, led by a menacing figure named Marco. He was a tall, menacing man with a dangerous glint in his eyes. Marco and his team claimed ownership of the shipwreck and accused us of trespassing. Panic set in as we realized we were caught in a deadly game. Marco was driven by an obsession to claim the treasure for himself, and he'd stop at nothing to achieve his goal. We tried to reason with him, explaining that we were there for a legitimate dive, but he was unyielding, his threats growing more chilling by the minute. As tensions escalated, I felt the cold, oppressive water closing in around us. Marco's group had us outnumbered, and it was clear that they were willing to use force to take the treasure. We were trapped in a life and death struggle, miles below the surface, with no one to hear our cries for help. The atmosphere grew increasingly suffocating as we fought to protect the treasure we'd found. Our dive had transformed into a nightmare, a desperate fight to survive. Sarah, our diving instructor, displayed incredible courage as she helped us defend ourselves against the ruthless rival treasure hunters. But the odds were against us, and I couldn't help but wonder if we ever see the surface again. As time passed, the stalemate continued. Marco's group was determined, but we were equally resolute. A sinister dance of threats and counter-threats unfolded in the eerie silence of the deep ocean. We knew that one wrong move could cost us our lives. Hours felt like days as we clung to our discovery, desperate to escape the clutches of our adversaries. The reality of our situation was inescapable. We were stranded in a life and death struggle, with darkness and danger lurking in the watery depths. Our dive had turned into a chilling game of survival, and the weight of the ocean above pressed down on us with relentless menace. With the situation growing increasingly dire, our crew began to contemplate an escape plan. We realized that our best chance was to make a break for it, sending toward the surface while Marco and his team remained focused on the treasure. It was a dangerous gambit, and we had to act quickly. When the moment came, we made our move. Sarah led us in a dash for the surface, our hearts pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The ascent was fraught with danger, and we knew that we were leaving the treasure behind, but our lives were more precious. Gasping for air, we broke the surface, leaving the haunting shipwreck and the chilling depths behind. Our escape had been a desperate gamble, but we had emerged with our lives intact. Our dive had transformed from a dream of adventure into a nightmarish struggle for survival. In the end, we reported our encounter to the authorities, but Marco and his crew managed to elude capture. They disappeared back into the depths, leaving us with the chilling memory of our deadly game in the deep blue sea. The dream of uncovering treasure had led us to a terrifying ordeal that still haunts our thoughts, a chilling encounter with ruthless rivals in the unforgiving realm of the ocean's depths.